Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Ren in Beijing. August 19th is World Humanitarian Day, designed to commemorate the death of 22 humanitarian aid workers in the 2003 bombing of the United Nations Baghdad headquarters, and to bring attention to the plight of those affected by humanitarian crisis today. What is the primary mission of the United Nations in this effort? What must be done to solve the many problems that exist? And as China continues to open up to the world, how can it contribute to the coordination and impact of international efforts? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined here in the studio by Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to Iran, and Fazan Kamalabadi, president of the Future Trans Group. But before we begin our discussion, let's look at this.
Friday is World Humanitarian Day, but with continued civil war, local tensions and rising terrorism, the world is struggling to deal with what has been called the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. Over 50% of the refugees come from war-torn states such as Syria, Afghanistan and Somalia, with Syria topping the list at 4.9 million. Past attempts to open up humanitarian corridors and establish brief ceasefires have largely failed.
They don't have a lot of access to clean water, very limited access to food. Shelter is a problem, and then we look at all the facilities that they need. Health facilities are being bombarded.
The UN is now calling for a 48-hour ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid into the hardest-hit areas of Aleppo. Russia and the US both back the idea of ending the violence. China is actively taking responsibility within its capacity to work with global organizations to offer help to those in need. But more global efforts are needed to stop repeating the mistakes of the past and to really shift towards more sustainable ways of avoiding humanitarian crises. Prevention is more effective than intervention.
Gentlemen, the humanitarian disaster that immediately comes to our mind is, of course, first and foremost, the disaster in Syria due to the war and the civil strife. But like the overwhelming majority of a humanitarian crisis, past and present, this one is driven by conflict, and the United Nations put the number at 80%. What do you make of the devastating humanitarian crisis there, and what can be done?
Conflicts have two categories. One is domestically. When ethnic conflicts between ethnic groups or religious groups, they have the conflicts, or people are being suppressed by certain dictators or tyrannies. And the second category is internationally. And a certain big power, they try to export their values and the political system to other nations by force, imposed such kind of political system. And we have seen 80% of these conflicts are these two categories, and mostly internationally. And because still we have, especially after the Second World War, certain big powers, they have tried to export, impose their values and the political systems or ideologies to other nations. So that's why we had the Korean War, we have the Vietnam War, we have the Iraq and the Libyan, and still we have Syrian War. So we have most of the refugees from these wars and these conflicts.
So in most cases, humanitarian disasters are actually driven by conflicts. since the end of the Second World War. By the way, this devastating civil strife is the worst of its kind since the end of the Second World War. Now, given the devastating consequences in the early days of the Arab Spring, Russia and China joined hand in using our veto to block the military intervention, and China and Russia both came under heavy fire from Western countries for using the veto. But it turned out that the military intervention wreaked havoc with Syria instead of solving the basic issue of humanitarian crisis, such as the refugee crisis. What do you think of, the China's diplomacy and military intervention by the West?
I do agree with you that prevention should be the solution rather than trying to solve after the disaster has happened. And prevention, I believe China in the future should take a leadership role in the world, both in its domestic and also in the global, not only in prevention but also after the disaster, and also in value, because the values are behind the conflicts. So what we call, as Professor Hua Liming said, a proxy war. The war is happened in that country, but it's actually driven by several interests, global interests outside. So we should prevent proxy wars. And also, as you said, genocide or domestic, because sometimes just a government or people, they do cleansing. And any of these are against the basic consciousness of humanity. So, and the problems are as deeper. In reality, we don't have yet a really true global world order. We don't have a real world order. We have nations who have vested interests, and as you said, the problems are either by nationalism, militant nationalism, or racialism, or religious or cultural strifes. And so to prevent, China should take a leadership role in bringing the concept or the emblem of global peace, consciousness, and the value for human life. I often say that China is not a second citizen or third citizen. In fact, China should be in the forefront of both human rights and humanitarianism.
Good point.
China is doing that.
Good point, Ambassador Hua. On the one hand, the Middle East, as in the case of Afghanistan, are always described like a graveyard for the major powers. But having said this, the Chinese government has sent its military delegation to Damascus to negotiate with the authorities there about the training and perhaps other humanitarian efforts by the Chinese military. Do you think China is ready to step in out of humanitarian reasons?
Chinese position on the international affairs, I think after 60 years, 6 decades, still is non-interference in internal affairs of other nations. It means China will never impose our ideology or impose Chinese political system or our values to other nations. And every sovereign state has their right to determine what road they will take and what kind of political system they will choose. So the reason that China, together with Russia, in 2011, vetoed the draft resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations was that China did not agree that a regime change from outside, even the United Nations, does not have the right to intervene into the Syrian internal affairs and let the Syrian people themselves to decide what kind of system they will choose.
Is that because of a very controversial violation of the UN resolution in the case of Libya? Because initially the UN resolution was meant to establish a no-fly zone and to separate the government forces from the rebel forces, and yet the US-led intervention violated the UN resolution. That led to the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi and, of course, killing of the strong man. And therefore, to my knowledge, Russia and China decided to draw a red line and told our friends in the West, enough is enough. Here is the red line. You don't have to violate this. Otherwise, you'll face severe consequences. But our friends in the West turned a deaf ear to the device. Hence, the devastating flow of asylum seekers to Western Europe. And that wreaked a humanitarian crisis and the rise of terrorism, right?
And often is what you said, is the motive behind. sometimes under the name of no-fly zone or humanitarian, or they come to say that we as an outsiders, we want to bring peace and order, but they actually create more conflict. We hope when China's leadership becomes stronger, China will show the true altruism. That means I don't have my agenda. I really want the best interests of others. Because China's foreign policy is changing. And China is trying to be more involved, not necessarily intervene or interfere, but more involved in the international say. I support that concept because all the different stakeholders are involved. We have one unified globe. The era that, oh, one nation, its own internal problems are their own problems is over. The international say has to have an influence in different nations. We cannot be keeping aloof. But when you interfere, what agenda do you have?
But I'm afraid, Ambassador Hua, the international society is still licking its wound when it's reviewing the massacre in Rwanda back in 1994. UN peacekeeping forces refused to intervene, and as a result, we had up to 900,000 people killed within less than 100 days. That's
so non-intervention is not the best solution, but it is the right intervention.
The issue is whether it is wise to step in to really engineer international intervention in such a case of extreme circumstances.
Personally, I don't agree that international community should stay aloof over these conflicts because people being massacred, there's genocide, there's a national cleansing. We should be intervene into these issues, but not by force, not by military interventions, but by encouraging the conflicting parts to sit down, to have a ceasefire first of all, and then have disengagement, then to have a peaceful settlement. If we talk about intervene, I think this kind of intervene can be justified other than military.
Well, the issue, I'm afraid, is your resolutions are not legally binding. We don't have the personnel to enforce the resolution. Therefore, in some cases, UN resolution, the UN Security Council was bypassed, unfortunately, by US-led coalition forces, like in the war on Iraq.
Exactly, I was going to say that sometimes even a collective military intervention may become necessary, but it must be truly not directed or forced or manipulated by one superpower. It must be a consensus, it must be a consultation. We have to learn consultation on the grassroots, consultation on the international order. We do need to create an institution even higher than a United Nations, what we call a federation of nations. Basically, the world needs a collective security, collective decision-making and collective consciousness, and yet we are yet behind from that. And when we, through these conflicts, we realize the impact of the conflicts is not only on two parties, only on several parties, it is on the global, because the borders are distant, and the impact, when refugees come, there is a shuffling of the world. The problem comes to our doorstep. Can we shut the door? No. I mean, these people are suffering. They were the victims of a conflict, and they come now to Europe. We should welcome them with jubilation, with open heart. These people are suffered in their home country, and they come to a new country, they become a second citizen. So the world has to learn about altruism, real love, and inner system, and also a conflict-solving consensus consultation system in the world.
Well said, well put. Let's look at yet another important issue of a great urgency. It's on the agenda of the Secretary Generals of the United Nations. That's number two. Number one is end and prevention of conflict. Number two is respect rules of war. 90% of people killed or injured by explosive weapons in populated areas are civilians. Every day, civilians are deliberately or indiscriminately killed in wars. And we are witnessing the erosion of 150 years of international humanitarian law. Why?
When we have conflicts, when we have war, the civilians, they are innocent people. They should be avoided from any kind of military forces. So bombing the hospitals, bombing the schools, bombing the innocent civilians, I think these are crimes. So those people, they engage the conflicts and the wars, They had to be observed. The civilians who are not parts of the war. Of course, it's quite difficult to decide, because sometimes one or both parties of the war, they are taking civilian people as hostages. Exactly. For instance, they have made their storage of rockets and the storage of the weapons in one hospital, in one schools, and then bombing happens to hospitals. People will accuse that you are bombing a hospital, but actually hospitals had been taken hostage as the war crimes.
It is very similar to a small...
Is that the human shield that
yeah.
was used by terrorists and those involved in the violence?
I mean, the minor form of that is in one family. Sometimes parents have fight, but they take the children as they're taking the sides or as a hostage. And that happens in a larger scale in the conflicts. But also the difference is that now, in the case of Vietnam War, Cambodian War, and in the case of many other wars, including the terrorism, young people are actually taken to become the warmongers. People at the age of 13 to 18 carrying weapons. So, and even in the case of Vietnam, even children. So it's not only that they are taken hostage, they are actually forced to participate. And that is even worse. It's like child abuse, actually. So the whole idea is the concept of the value of humanity, the concept of value of life, preciousness of life is forgotten. People become numb to the news that 130 million people are refugees. People say, oh, it's far. It's very ironic that when a disaster like an earthquake happens, people are more humanitarian. Somehow, a disaster they identify with better. But war, okay, some people started this war and conflict and it's their lives. Somehow people become numb and they don't care as much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. You are watching Dialogue with Ambassador Hua Liming and Mr. Fazan Kalmalabadi. We are discussing impact of a humanitarian disaster on the state to commemorate the Humanitarian Day. We'll be back in a short while. Welcome back. With the rapid development of high technology, particularly with the use of laser-guided bombs and smart bombs, Western media allegedly says the casualty of civilians have been reduced to the minimum. Now the issue, the Western media coverage aside, let's look at the casualties of civilians in sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shiites in the Middle East. It's driven by ideology, it's driven by ethnic and religious hate. What can be done to persuade parties in the violence that they need to show the least some degree of respect for civilian casualty, right?
I think behind all these sectarian or religious conflicts still are the Cold War mentality. Because actually, as Farzan just said, sometimes we see that the sectarian war or the religious war between certain nations, actually this is a proximity war between themselves. For instance, when the war between Iran and Iraq started, I was in Tehran. Actually, Iraq was used as a dam to stop the Iranian revolutionary influence to the Arab heartland. So all the Arab countries are behind Saddam Hussein, even the United States and the whole the Western countries. So apparently it was a war between the Shia and Sunni, but actually this is a part of the Cold War in 1980s.
It was more Persian and Arab rather than Sunni or Shia.
Yes.
So what is the silver lining? What is the silver lining? What is the silver bullet in seeking a solution to the chronic sectarian violence?
I believe very simple. There are different causes of war. There are nationalism, economic disparity, religious, and hatred behind them. And hatred comes from ignorance. The problem is that actually we sow the seeds. We educate people to be like that. Then the conflict comes, we say, why is it happening? We talk, oh, nationalism is the pride we should have. Even let's say the case of, let's say, I want to say the example of China and Japan. It's both-sided. When we sow the seed of nationalism, later, someday the conflict will come. Arab and the Jewish. The seed is sown every day that you must hate the other side. And we don't realize the commonness of humanity. When we sow the seed under the name of pride of nationalism, pride of this religion, we are the right, they are wrong, and so we justify that the killing and the human life has no value. Why? Because they are criminals. No war happens with the idea that we are unfair and they are very fair. No, we always kill others that we think they are criminals.
Therefore, gentlemen, do you think democracy is a good idea? Democracy is viewed by most in the West as a solution, if not a silver bullet, to the chronic sectarian violence in the Middle East.
Democracy, if not imposed from outside, I agree with you. But we have seen all the cases, all the examples, democracy imposed from outside.
Then what about Chinese investment in, for example, construction of infrastructure in developing countries as an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative to help raise the level of prosperity? Do you think this will be more helpful?
Because in Chinese view, one of the roots of the conflicts or the war is poverty.
Exactly.
So China is helping these nations to first solve the problems of poverty and to industrialization, and let people have a more point of view of civilization and industrialization. I think to help this country, to assist in this country economically, is one of the ways to solve the problem of conflicts.
It's a very important way, a practical way. Why? Because the search for a just society has been a 10,000-year search and hasn't come, but it is the cause of problem. The causes of problem are two, practical and emotional, and they are always interfacing with each other. And economic, not only poverty, but justice is one of the main problems. For example, in Tunisia, it started by one person who was a PhD doctor who could not even sell his goods, and then he put himself on fire. And somebody used that for this economic disparity, and then became a political conflict. And soon it became a whole Arab Spring. It started from an economic injustice, a quest for a better. So the more we are involved in even in business, it must be win-win-win. If our international order, international contracts, international considerations are win-win-win and prosperity for all of humanity, I think problems will be solved to a lot degree. But at the same time, it is consciousness and education and thinking. It is more on the level of real religious or super consciousness that we are one. The unity of the world of the humanity, the oneness of the world of humanity.
It's not only the P5 of the UN Security Council, but organizations such as African League deserve credit for sending blue helmet troops in maintaining peace and order in some of the countries that are mired in upheavals and domestic violence. What do you think of the role China, along with the other major powers, play in, for example, Somalia and Mali, where some of our peacekeeping soldiers got killed recently?
China's position to peacekeeping forces is quite positive, and China has been one of the strong supporter of sending peacekeeping troops to other parts of the world, even remote areas as far as Africa and Middle East countries. Of course, the peacekeeping forces is not to involve in the wars between the conflicting parts. It's just to make two parts disengaged, and to divide the war, and to avoid the military conflicts happen in one country or between two countries.
What do you think of the image of China in the context of the South China Sea, where you see the growing rivalry between the United States and China as part of the Back to Asia strategy? This issue seems to have diverted public attention from many other areas where we have an overlap in the common stakes with the United States, such as peacekeeping in Africa and other developing countries. Let's put aside the blueprint of One Belt and One Road initiative. This is not occasion to discuss that. But what about the joint and common stakes that should be shared more increasingly by major powers?
The main point is that the past 35 years, China's positive image has been growing. on the level of announcing the peaceful rise of China, China harmonious society, itself creating a peace within its own societies, and participation in the world affairs, in environment, in aid. The only thing is that when it comes to its own national interests, this case, it gave the international community a feeling of double standard. I'm not saying yes or no, I'm not taking judgment. It's saying that, we want a world order, we want a world, but if my conflict comes to the world and the world votes against me, why should I be angry at that? So I think this building is more important. So sometimes you lose, or you don't be so forceful about a right for my own right of a land or territory that you claim to. You be a little bit soft-spoken and win the respect of the global community, rather than to say, oh, a world order or a world community, whether justified or not justified, order something, and you be very tough about it. So I suggest China knows, you know,
well, the existing international order, economic and political alike, is actually based on the rules and norms that were first generated and formulated by the West. And therefore, President Obama says it's the U.S. and the West that should write the rules, not China. Having said this, even from days of Kofi Annan, former General Secretary of the United Nations, the international society says human rights knows no boundary. Therefore, that has somehow justified the military interventionism. Looking back, international or military interventionism brought about more disasters than stability. So what do you think of the Chinese policy of no strings in Africa? We, of course, make a lot of investment. At the same time, we are expected to step in politically and help reduce the tyranny of the so-called dictatorship in some of the developing countries.
I think the humanitarian intervention is one of the problems. When I was ambassador to the Netherlands, and when the Kosovo War was going on, European people, most of them, they insisted that because of the ethnic cleansing happened in Bosnia and in former Yugoslavia, so they have to, NATO have to start a war against former Yugoslavia. But I said, this is the interventionism, and the intervention to a sovereign state. I didn't agree with that. So this is one of the debates we used to have with most of the Western people and the Europeans.
Right. Ethnic cleansing in Srebrenica, in former Yugoslavia, did bring about NATO intervention, and Slobodan Milosevic was brought to justice by being sent to The Hague by his own nationals. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on Humanitarian Day of the United Nations. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.